Goldie is a golden retriever who's been with our family for over 5 years now. She loves to go camping with us. I have a travel trailer that I use a lot. Almost every weekend in the summer, the wife, my son, and I are camping at some campground. We live in Ohio, but we go all over to camp. This one weekend in June, we didn't travel far and camped at Mohican State Park. The second day there, I was taking Goldie for a walk along the river trails. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when I heard something from off the trail come barreling through the woods. I thought it was a deer or possibly a black bear, but then it stops. Like it must have caught wind of us or something. Goldie steps in front of me and starts doing this low growl at the woods. She sensed something was off right away, and the motion from this thing startled her at first. I'm standing there and I can't see anything because the woods were pretty thick in that area. I pulled her lead a little, signaling her that we need to turn around and go back, but she won't budge. Then I start to hear this thing come out from the woods. It's slowly making its way to the trail. I start yelling in case it's a bear, saying, "Get out of here, bear." But what happened next shocked me to my core. I'm yelling and Goldie is there growling like I've never seen her before. She's such a mild-mannered dog and total sweetheart. This monstrous, and I mean monstrous figure, comes walking out of the woods, making all kinds of noises as it's walking. Twigs and branches are snapping. It's just covered in long, dark fur from head to toe, except for its face. It stares right at me and raises it one hand. I'm not sure what it was doing, but it put its arm over its head and stood there making this grunting sound. Goldie at this point is going nuts, barking her head off, and it seems like this thing is annoyed at all of the barking and covered its ears. I'm trying to hold on to the lead as best as I can because Goldie just won't stop. This giant beast looks at Goldie, then turns and goes back into the woods. She wouldn't leave for another minute or so because I think she wanted to make sure the threat was gone. We eventually get back to camp, and I told my wife and kid about the entire experience. It was crazy, to say the least. We ended up going home later that afternoon. I did tell the local ranger about the incident, but I think he just passed it off as a black bear. That thing was a sasquatch. I have no doubt in my mind. And my sweet girl saved me from whatever that thing intended to do. This past winter I went hunting, and if I knew what was going to transpire, I would have stayed home. My family owns a piece of property of about 20 acres, and we'd gone there every year for as long as I could remember. We had a tiny cottage on the property, nothing too big, but it was all we really needed. I drove in around 5 that evening and settled into the cottage. I intended to get a good night's sleep and get up early enough to catch the morning deer walking by. I was full of excitement, so it was hard to sleep. Each time I'd look at the clock, only minutes had gone by. As restless as I was, I figured I'd get back up and make myself a cup of hot tea to calm my nerves. I put a pot of water on the stove and slid on my jacket, stepping to step outside while I waited. The air was cool, and I took a deep breath in. I loved the fresh outdoor air, and I didn't get that much in the city. The sky was clear, and full moon cast its light over the tops of the trees. The aroma and coos of nightlife only fed my eagerness. I could hear the crickets humming and a distant howling wolf. I returned inside to steep my tea, then headed back outside. Now, the once distant wolf sounded a lot closer. It was pretty common for wolves to be out and about. However, for us hunters, that meant there was a possibility they would snag a deer right out from under your nose. I didn't mind them, though. After all, they needed to eat too, so I thought to myself, may the best predator win. Once I finished my tea, I headed back to bed. I awoke at 3 in the morning. I got ready and headed out to my deer tent that was smack dab in the middle of our property. I made myself cozy and waited in anticipation for the first wave of deer. One thing about hunting is you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to make very little movement or sound. I had been doing it for most of my life, so needless to say, I felt like a pro. Around an hour later, around 4 in the morning, the first wave of deer came. Most people would take their shot as soon as they could, but I liked to watch them graze on the fields for a little. It must have been a cluster mixed of around 10 deer, including does, baby deer. When hunting, it's frowned upon to shoot the mother deer if it's near the doe. Reason being, the doe still needs to grow alongside its mother so that it can survive and go off on its own. I figured that's 4 deer that were unaccompanied by a baby doe. I was just about to raise my gun when I heard leaves rustling. I looked and noticed something running towards the deer, and fast. I turned to face it directly, and before I knew what was happening, a wolf jolted and took a hold of a deer, making the rest of them scatter. There was a lot of commotion, and so I couldn't make anything out at first. But finally, everything settled, and then I could see something hunched over the deer. It looked like a wolf, only it had abnormally long legs. I couldn't compute what I was seeing. The wolf was huge, bigger than it should have been. And I watched as it stayed munching on the deer for a bit before dragging it off. I waited a good 15 minutes or so to make sure the coast was clear. I slung my gun over my shoulder, left the tent, and approached the area where the wolf ran up on the deer. Upon further examination, I noticed the tracks seemed off. I had been hunting all my life and could easily identify track marks from different animals. I thought it's possible it was a different breed. Or maybe when all the deer scattered their tracks and were mashed with the wolves. I was too shaken up to figure it out, though, and I didn't even want to try and wait for another herd to come by, so I packed up for the day and returned to the cabin. The rest of that evening I was restless, but this night it wasn't because of excitement. It was now 7 in the evening, and I just wanted to go to sleep so that I could go out tomorrow and score. Problem was, I wasn't tired. I decided to make a fire out back for the steak and cook up some soup in the kitchen. I was going back and forth from outside to the kitchen to check on my soup. At one point while inside, I glanced out the window at the fire and did a double take when a figure caught my eye. It watched as it prowled around the fire. This animal was too big and furry to be a common wolf. My first instinct was to grab my gun, which was in the next room. I got it and cocked it since it was already loaded. I then crept back to the window and saw the beast prop itself up on its back legs. The window was cracked just enough for the mouth of my gun to slide through, and I could get a clean shot if I needed to. The creature was distracted enough by the steak cooking that I had time to aim perfectly. And just as I was about to shoot a warning shot, the moon crept through the clouds. That made the beast turn abruptly and let out a loud howl. The howl spooked me, and my gun accidentally went off. I ducked below the window. My heart was racing, and I then slowly raised my head. I didn't see anything from my window, so I slowly cracked open the back door. Whatever it was long gone. I brought out a flashlight to check for blood, thinking I could have shot the beast, but there was no trace. I never went back to that cabin alone after that. Too much trauma for me. Because whatever creature I saw that day, I'm convinced it is still out there somewhere. In the winter of 2002, I was a police officer in Athens, Ohio, home of Ohio University. As any cop in a small college town will tell you, Thursday nights can get a little wild. Most of the kids leave campus on Friday night to head home and visit their parents, do laundry, and beg a little spending money for the week. So Thursday nights reign as party nights on campuses and in fraternities where kids would rather go to class hungover on Friday morning than forego the drinking entirely. I want to say it was mid-December and the last Thursday before finals week and subsequent Christmas break, making it the wildest Thursday night of the year. Ohio University is home to 4 fraternities and 3 sororities, and most of our Thursday night calls centered around the inhabitants of one of the more popular frat houses. In recent months, most of our calls to that particular fraternity had been centered around a series of practical jokes played on the elderly man who lived across the alley. He had made a few noise complaints, and it had created a sort of ongoing battle between him and the fraternity itself. I, personally, had been called out at least a half a dozen times to deal with these issues, and I can't even begin to guess how many other officers had been sent to deal with the same stuff on their shifts. The old guy's name was Eugene, and it would be unfair of me to make him out as some sweet, innocent man fallen victim to the immaturity of the boys that lived in the frat house. Eugene was a troublemaker too, and had a rap sheet as long as my arm from a lifetime of petty crime, and he certainly got his own blows in during the dispute. Between the fraternity poisoning Eugene's garden with Roundup and Eugene hitting the back windows of their house with a pellet gun, there were at least a dozen other instances of back-and-forth jabs that had turned from humorous to downright uncivil over time. A few weeks before the night in question, though, the battle came to an abrupt end when Eugene suffered a heart attack and died watching a football game at his sister's house. The whole street had been quiet since he left, and, somewhat ironically, the fraternity had held off their partying for a few weeks out of respect for Eugene. It seemed like a worthless gesture, since what he really would have liked was for the partying to let up while he was alive. But myself and the other officers appreciated a few weeks of quiet patrols. I knew they wouldn't skip the Friday before finals and home, though, so I was ready to handle some complaints when I checked into work that night. It wasn't long before I got the first call out to the fraternity, not by a neighbor reporting noise, though. This call came from the boys at the frat house themselves. When I got there, they told me they'd been setting up for the party and someone had stolen the keg off the back porch. I chalked it up to a college prank, told them the keg would likely resurface later, or at another frat party, and that I'd make a report, but there wasn't much I could do without any solid leads. They weren't happy with me, but they couldn't argue. They knew by now how these things worked. I got back in my car and answered a couple more calls, a domestic dispute across town and a Christmas tree that had caught fire. I pulled over a girl for speeding. Then, as I was getting ready to park and wait for my next interaction, I got dispatched back to the fraternity a second time. Again, the call came from the frat boys themselves. When I got there, everyone was huddled in the living room toward the front of the house. The back door, which faced the alley, had been blown right off its hinges and was laying flat on the floor in the kitchen. The door facing and all was still attached. I asked what happened, but nobody really seemed to know. They were hanging out and drinking, they said, when suddenly the whole thing flew into the house like a gust of wind had hit it. But there hadn't been any strong winds. The streamers on the back porch were still undisturbed. I looked the door over and saw no evidence that it had been kicked in or a bomb had gone off either. It was really puzzling me, and I was beginning to wonder if the partiers weren't playing a prank on me. It was about that time that someone who was standing and looking out the hole where the back door used to be noticed someone walking around in Eugene's backyard. I turned and looked just in time to catch it too. It was clearly a person hunched over and sneaking behind the old shed behind Eugene's place, so I called out for them to stop. I knew nobody was supposed to be over there. I'd talked to Eugene's sister just the day before, and she told me she wasn't planning to start cleaning the house out until after Christmas passed. The figure never came back, though, nor did they emerge from the other side. I decided to head over and have a look. The snow had been falling on a few separate occasions since Eugene passed, and his backyard was blanketed in a clear and solid blanket of snow. There weren't even squirrel tracks anywhere to be seen, and certainly not adult human footprints either. There was no person hiding behind the shed. There was no indication that anyone had ever been over there at all. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe me and the witness both had been seeing things shadows from all the Christmas lights and trees around the area. Perhaps. But as I turned with my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of something through the window of the shed. There in the middle of the floor, in the middle of that locked shed, sat the stolen keg from earlier. I knew it was the same keg because the boys had reported earlier in the day that the liquor store had written the fraternity's name in black permanent marker across the side of it when they put it on reserve. I never told the kids. I just left it there and let Eugene have the last word. I can't believe I haven't told anyone about this before, but this happened years ago. I grew up in a really small town where everybody knew everybody, so I pretty much got free rein as long as I was back home before dinner. During the summer, I would spend hours every day playing in the woods behind my house. But then I got older, and my tiny community started feeling small. I needed to experience more. I was sick of hanging out with my parents and their friends. I wanted to get out in the world. Just before I wrapped up my senior year and a couple weeks after my 18th birthday, I got a college acceptance letter from one of my top schools. You would not believe how excited I was. When summer was over, I would finally be on my way to a nice university in a decent-sized city, far away from my boring little town. I started counting the days pretty much the second I graduated. I was hoping to spend the whole summer sleeping and playing video games so the time would pass quicker. Unfortunately, my parents had other ideas. They wanted us to spend time with family. My aunt, uncle, and little cousin would be coming to stay with us for a month, a whole month. My aunt and uncle were taking our guest room, which meant I had to share my room with my cousin Henry. I was livid. Not only was I still stuck at home until the fall, I also had to be roomies with a first grader. But it gets worse. My aunt and uncle just wanted to hang out with my parents all the time. So guess who got stuck Henry sitting? That's right, me. I figured out a pretty slick system, though. I'd just walk him to the woods or the swimming hole and let him go nuts while I read comics. He was occupied and happy I was occupied and, well, not completely miserable at least. Still, I was pretty mad. Mostly at my aunt and uncle for just passing their kid off on me, and my parents for going along with it. But I couldn't exactly take out my frustrations on them. So I did something, well, immature. I took it out on Henry. Look, it's not like I hurt him or anything. Even as upset as I would never do that. I just, well, spooked him a bit. See, we have this local legend about a terrifying monster that lives in the woods. The details are a little fuzzy because they change depending on who you ask, but most people agree on red eyes, bat wings, horse head, and goat legs. Oh, and a tail like a cartoon devil. I started telling Henry all sorts of stories. He hung on to every word. It was so fascinating to him, he kept begging me to tell him more. Probably not the best thing to tell a first grader, but I told him about the livestock killings and the mysterious noises and the creepy shapes in the dark. Some of the stories were ones I heard from friends and neighbors as a kid. Everybody around here's got a cousin whose friend's great aunt saw it. Others I totally made up. Either way, Henry was hooked. We were both starting to have fun with it. I was enjoying the look on his face when I acted out a scary detail that literally just popped into my head. He started playing Monster Hunter imaginary games where he'd pretend to search the forest for signs of the monster. But of course, that was all during the daytime. You know how kids are. They're all bravado when the sun's out, but as soon as it's bedtime, they're scared of their own shadows. It was just before dinner one night. Suddenly, my uncle came up to me looking majorly ticked off. He said that Henry was crying, and it was my fault. Apparently, Henry had left his stuffed dog where he was playing in the woods earlier in the day. He knew exactly where it was, so my uncle told him to run and get it before dark, but Henry wouldn't go. He was too scared because he thought the monster was going to get him. Boy, if looks could kill, I'd be dead on 4 counts. Henry's parents were mad at me for making their kid cry, and my parents were mad at me for messing with my little cousin. And honestly, Henry crying was getting to me. I grumbled all the way across my yard and into the trees. It wasn't hard to find the stupid dog. I found it after literally only about 5 minutes of walking, sitting in the nest of leaves Henry had built for it. By that time, it was getting harder to see because the sun was going down, making everything hazy. I knew the woods like the back of my hand, but I wasn't stupid enough to get caught in them in the dark. The woods in New Jersey have all sorts of low-growing shrubs and things that exist to hide hole and trip you. I figured I was already in enough trouble without coming back with a sprained ankle. I turned around and started to head back, Henry's stupid stuffed dog under my arm, when I heard a scream. I thought someone might be in trouble, so I went to check it out. I knew there was a small clearing that dipped down into a mini valley about a dozen yards northwest of my parents' house. In the summer, we get hikers coming through the woods, and sometimes they camp in that clearing. The way the sound bounced, I thought the scream had come from there. I peeked out from behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. There was someone out there. It had its back turned, but there was no mistaking the bat wings, horse head, everything. The monster from my supposedly made-up stories was standing right there on the other side of the clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I was terrified the monster would hear it. Maybe if I didn't make any noises, it would just go away. Then I could run home. I just had to stay quiet. Really, really quiet. Then I could back away, get out of there, give Henry his stupid stuffed animal, and pretend none of this ever happened. But as I was trying to take deep breaths so my breathing wouldn't be loud, I accidentally shifted back, right onto a dry branch. It's every horror movie cliche ever, and yes, now I realize it's for a reason because it happens. But when that branch snapped, that thing out in the clearing heard me. I saw it turn, saw red eyes, and just sprinted. I've never run so fast in my life. The trees were literally blurring around me, and I know it was a pure miracle I didn't trip and fall flat on my face. To this day, I have no idea whether it was actually chasing me or not. I didn't care. If the back door to the kitchen hadn't been unlocked, I probably would have broken it down because I hit it running. Everyone was in the dining room eating and talking. I wanted to run in and start screaming to my parents. Legal adult or not, I wanted them to tell me everything was okay, but I didn't. Considering what I'd been telling Henry all this time, actually admitting to a monster encounter would look like me still trying to scare him. I ended up just returning Henry's dog, and my parents asked if I had learned my lesson. I gave a very emphatic yes, and they were happy with that. I never told them about what I saw, and I didn't tell Henry any more monster stories. Sometimes I don't even want to leave my house based on what I have seen. My family thinks I'm nutty, my friends think I am being ridiculous for attention, and the police, they literally told me that I needed to think of a better prank and hire a therapist. I'll tell you exactly what I have seen. There needs to be awareness out there. I traveled about 2.5 hours from my home to do some exploring in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'm not big on hiking or whatever, but I recently went through a breakup. I just wanted some fresh air and maybe even some nice nature pics for my Instagram. A nice adventure, I suppose. I parked and just started wandering. I didn't follow a specific path. I created my own. My phone was set to track my path so that I wouldn't get lost. Technology is great. As I was wandering, I got some pretty nice pics of some gigantic trees, some cool-looking spider webs, and even a little snake. I was really enjoying myself, making my own way, and just breathing. I had been going for almost 2 hours when I saw a large hole in one of the mountain walls. It wasn't too far from me, and it was a manageable climb. When I got to the hole, I stuck my head in, and it was so dark. So I turned on my phone's flashlight, and that's when I realized this was a cave. I got a little carried away thinking about how I had discovered a cave, wondering if anyone else had ever been here. It was exciting. Of course, I ducked down and walked in. I went in a few feet. I was being super careful, but I could see a smooth rock floor beneath me. I felt safe. So I kept walking forward, following the light from my flashlight, taking a picture here and there. I was maybe 15 or 16 feet in when I realized I was in a cavern, a cave room. There were a few openings in the walls surrounding the cavern. I picked the closest one to me and looked in. It was another tunnel. I could tell it was big enough to walk through, so I stepped through the opening and carefully walked a few more feet. I heard skittering. I stopped walking, thinking maybe I had kicked something. I looked all around on the ground and saw nothing. I heard skittering again. When I raised my phone up to look ahead of me, I saw a person. Only like not a person. It was fully nude and looked really malnourished. It was crouched down on its hands and feet about 4 feet in front of me. It was so pale, like maybe it had never been in the sun. Its face was sunken in, and I could clearly see its cheekbones. It had all black eyes, not just the pupils like us, but all black. Between its hands on the ground was a half-eaten rabbit. I don't want to get too detailed because some people may have weak stomachs. I honestly thought I might hurl. I heard the skittering sound again and realized that it was making that noise. I don't know how I knew, but it was calling for its friends or family. Back up. I don't know, but it was trying to communicate and not with me. I moved back towards the way I came, but I kept my flashlight on it. It didn't seem to like the light too much. It didn't even try to move towards me at all. I was able to get back through the hole. I took a quick look around and didn't see anything else. I ran for my life back the way I came. I could hear skittering and it was getting closer and louder. There had to be more than one. I felt like that rabbit, like I was being hunted. I was able to see the light from the original opening when I tripped. I dropped my phone, and I'm not even going to lie. I didn't even try to pick it up. I got right on up and got out of that hole. I ran down that mountain. I was panting so hard, but my adrenaline would not let me stop. I only stopped when I was sure nothing had followed me. I realized I had no phone and no idea where I was. Honestly, I was just happy to be alive. I did eventually find a trail and managed to make it back to my car. I went to the local police station, which was pointless. They wouldn't take me seriously, so I just drove home. I cried and screamed so much on the drive. When I got home, I checked my phone's location. When I used the satellite feature, all I could see was a heavily wooded area, no cave mouth. The last time I checked the location of my phone, it had moved over a mile away from the original place I dropped it. It only had about 3% battery left, so I'm sure it has long died. That's what happened. I feel like I could have been eaten. I'm so lucky that I didn't freeze up. I honestly wish I had taken a picture when I first saw that pale person. I didn't even think about it. All my other pictures were uploaded to the cloud. Anyways, I won't go into any unexplored caves anymore. I mean, even caves that have been explored are probably dangerous. I wouldn't go in one anymore. I'll be the first to admit that I wasn't the most career-driven person. I wasn't anything less than a slack-off growing up, and it's kind of a wonder I even graduated high school. But after that, it's not like I had a promising career in my future. I was looking at a life spent removing pests from suburban houses or risking my life to put out fires. And knowing my track record, I probably wouldn't have been good at either. I had a good couple of friends, though, and one of them was generous enough to offer me a job as a traveling salesman working for their uncle's company. It seemed like the only option as a deadbeat 22-year-old who'd been fired from their last 2 gigs. I happily accepted and mentally decided it was time for a change. So I started up with the job, traveling to small neighboring towns in my beat-up Volkswagen for the first few months. I was making a modest living, and it felt good to complete a job well done. I was eventually told I had to go on the road for a 3-town trip, so I'd have to find a place to stay for a night. This job was anything but glamorous, and the lodging was up to me to figure out. With the limited means I had available, I was lucky to have even found the place I did called, the Crampton Lodge. The Crampton Lodge was not a lodge at all, but a 1-story, battered and beaten motel with an interminably lit vacancy sign. It was the only establishment I'd seen for miles, and having already hit 2 stops that day, I was tired and getting ready to sleep in the car. The motel lobby was dirty-looking and poorly lit. There was no one behind the desk, so I tapped my hand on the dinky little bell. An old, sleepy-looking man emerged from the back office with an unfriendly expression on his face. He almost wordlessly checked me into room number 4 and handed me the key. I offered a smile, but he was already shutting himself into the back office before I could do so. Room number 4 was expectedly unwelcoming. There was a dingy queen bed and a small, super old-school TV on top of a scuffed dresser. The bathroom was a horrible green tile from floor to ceiling. It made me dizzy. I turned on the TV to block out whatever sounds might carry over from the other rooms. The connection was pretty shabby, but I finally settled on some old black and white movie. I took a shower, but I felt grosser than I had before. Everything about this place was just off. I just wanted to fall asleep, wake up, and leave. But when I walked back into the bedroom, the TV station had changed. It was an entirely black screen with a perfectly defined graphic of a white square in the middle, growing and shrinking rhythmically. The picture quality was too good for the TV. I was puzzled. I tried to change the channel, but to no avail. When I pressed the power button on the remote, still nothing, and nothing even when I unplugged the TV from the wall. The screen just kept glowing back at me, that white square taunting me, growing and shrinking as it did. I was honestly pretty freaked out, and I was going to march right up to that grumpy old man at the front desk and demand a different room. But when I touched the handle of the door, I winced. It was hot, like there was a fire outside. I glimpsed out through the dinky blinds covering the window. No fire. But when I tried my hand on the door again, the heat was unbearable. I groaned. This was definitely the worst place on earth for a traveler. I saw movement through the gaps in the blinds. If I could get that person's attention, maybe they could help me out. I ducked my head around and under the blinds. There was someone out there all right, but it didn't look like they wanted to help me. Their faces were remarkably smooth and pale like a ghost. White, actually. As white as a piece of paper. Just inches from the glass of the window pane, this face stared expressionless and straight into me. It was hard to take in. They were completely bald, including their eyebrows. There were zero signs of aging whatsoever on their faces, just white stretched skin wrapped tightly around bone and tissue. The lips were a cold, bitter red like blood in the snow. I stared into their black eyeballs with a dry mouth. Had they been waiting for me? Where had they come from? They weren't standing there the first time I looked out, just seconds before. I watched as the figure reached a ghastly white hand up in front of their face. I don't know how or why, but I couldn't stop myself. I mirrored them with my hand, following in a trance as both of our palms pressed flatly together, separated only by the glass of the window. When we did this, I felt a surge of either blistering heat or blackening cold shoot up through my arm, sending me staggering backward. At the same time, the power in my room shut off, including the picture on the television. I sat on the ground, panting and terrified, for what felt like hours. I was too scared to get up, to look out the window. When the doorknob rattled and began to turn, I felt my heart drop to the bottom of my stomach. I gulped. But it was just the grumpy old man from the front desk. He had switched a fuse and the power would be back on shortly. I nodded, still in disbelief. I woke up the next morning in that same spot. I'd fallen asleep there. But when I saw that fresh light of morning, I had never been so relieved. I wasted no time in vacating that room, ready for the day of work, determined to do whatever it took to never wind up in a place like that again.